John Gray was born in England in 1926, just south of Nottingham.
I was growing up during the war. We often used to hear the German bombers going over. They would drop the occasional bomb. It was a very ordinary life. Nothing special.
He was one of 4 brothers. One of the 4 brothers suffered from cerebral palsy.
And his presence, I think, had a profound effect on us as children.
The other 3 became doctors.
I always felt that I wanted to spend some time abroad in an area where there's perhaps need of a doctor.
In John's life, 3 strange coincidences would decide his fate. As a boy in Sunday school, he was given a brochure about Wilfred Grenfell, an English medical missionary and adventurer who started the Grenfell Mission.
There was a romantic side to him, you know, traveling, dashing around on a dog sled and visiting isolated communities in his hospital ship. It was all very exciting to me as a small boy, and I never forgot that.
The second coincidence occurred when John received an anonymous letter from a mysterious lady.
A young chap like you shouldn't be staying in England, she said. You should be getting abroad. Why don't you go to a place like Labrador with the Grenfell Mission, you see?
The third coincidence that convinced him to follow in Grenfell's footsteps was a simple Christmas card.
The Grenfell cards were the very first charity cards that were sold at Christmas, and I thought that this might be pointing me in the direction of this organisation.
Joining the Grenfell Mission in 1956, John left England on board a boat bound for Canada. The mission was set up to provide the poverty-stricken people of Northern Newfoundland and Labrador with food, clothing, and medical care.
We were the only medical service in Labrador and in Northern Newfoundland, in the outports.
In the 50s and early 60s, the communities Dr. Gray served, especially in Labrador, were extremely remote and isolated.
There were no roads, there were no landing strips.
Patients could only be reached by dog sled in the winters when the bay would freeze over with ice. In the summers, John would travel to see his patients by float plane or by hospital ship.
I found it very rewarding in the sense that I was providing a service to a people who, had I not been there, they wouldn't have had any medical service. We would try to have set hours for the consultations, but obviously there were times when I would have to go out and see them in their own home, and I often did. A gentleman came from a community, I would say about 20 miles away, by dog team. His wife was very ill in the small community in which they lived, and would I go back with him to see her and treat her? And I remember it very distinctly because it was my very first trip. And this was a bitterly cold. It was about 40 below, I believe. The station foreman, realizing that what I'd come out from Britain with in terms of clothing would not be totally adequate for a dog team trip, and he had in his possession a former Canadian Air Force flying suit. And he gave me this. It was one complete suit, and you zipped up in the middle, and it was exceedingly warm. And I accompanied him down the bay. Having never been on a sled, I just sat, and occasionally I would get off and run alongside if I was getting cold. It was quite exciting because you whip along. Well, you seem to whip along. I mean, you have to run for the most part to keep up with the dogs if the going is good. And it was on this particular day. The wife, actually, she was quite ill. I had to stay overnight and sleep in a simple home. This was my very first experience of staying in one of their homes and seeing how simple life was. A tub for water in the porch, and making use of the woods for toilet purposes and that sort of thing. They were hardy people. I mean, this was their life, and it was the norm for them, but it was certainly not my norm at that time. Grenfell had his own dogs, incidentally, actually, but at Cartwright we didn't have our own team, but there was a very knowledgeable and capable chap that I used to make use of, Mr. Henry John Williams. He was a very enterprising, hard-working man, and he just knew what to do at all times. He knew that coast like the back of his hand, and so did his dogs. And only once did we ever get lost. We were approaching the southern nursing station at a place called Mary's Harbour. To get there, we'd cross several bays, and Hindley. John was certain we should go straight across the bay, but then he saw a whole lot of sled marks going down the bay towards the head of the bay. And he thought, well, this is very odd, but that's where all the tracks go, so we started off. And then he said, Doctor, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. He said we should be over on the other side of that bay. Anyway, by the time we got to the other side of the bay, it was virtually dark and it was impossible to go on. And so we made a fire and we just dug a hole in the snow with snowshoes, and I put in my palliasse, well, a sleeping bag, and so slept.
In the summers, John would travel to see his patients by float plane or by hospital ship.
This is a model of the Marival. I spent many a happy hour on this. There was an X-ray unit on board and all the medications were kept there. There was a dark room that we could use to develop the X-ray films. We would dock in a little bay, you see, where there was the community, and they would come out in their rowboats, in their little dinghies, and then they would come on board and I would see them in the dispensary area. We used to go into every single community that we could do in the summer with this vessel, with the main objective of not only picking up people who are sick, but those who had tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was so absolutely rampant.
He worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Always on call. He had one weekend off apart from when we were back in England every 4th year, he had one weekend off in 25 years.
Fiona came out as a volunteer, really as a sort of dog's body in a sense. That means she had to be a jack of all trades. My first meeting with her was on the hospital steps, and I can remember it to this day. I found her an attractive young lady, obviously.
Fiona left after a year to return home to England. Soon after, John would follow her back to England, where they would marry in March of 1960. Their daughter, Angela, was only 6 months old when they returned to Labrador in 1961. Their 3 boys were born in St. Anthony. Raising a family in a remote community could sometimes prove challenging.
Not much variety of food, so it was always a challenge in getting meals. Oh, I know, no restaurants at all. Even a cup of coffee to go out and buy one, absolutely nowhere. So one had to provide 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Shopping for the children, there was nothing you could buy in St. Anthony in those days, absolutely nothing at all. So when we came back every 4th year, we had to bring all the children's clothes and everything to last 3 years.
Think of how good a diagnostician anyone would be after being the only internist for years and years and years.
In the early 70s, I guess it was, I came to realize that a significant percentage of the patients that I was seeing were elderly. And it soon became apparent that their needs were different. And I came to realize how very little I really knew about geriatric medicine.
And he also realized that there was something to be done by specializing in geriatric medicine and learning how to care for frail older adults. In 1980, Dr. Gray was invited to join the faculty at Dalhousie University.
It was a person who was willing to devote himself to the care of elderly and that whole area of geriatrics, and this was really a new challenge.
At the time, there wasn't an established academic medical center in geriatric medicine in Canada. Dalhousie gave John a year's sabbatical leave to spend in the UK.
England was way ahead of us in terms of directing its attention to the care of the elderly.
Upon his return, he would oversee the creation of the Division of Geriatric Medicine at Dalhousie University, one of the first in Canada.
The real teaching that John did was by people watching how he cared for people. And John was one of the pioneers. And we now have an outstanding group that we're very proud of. Well, he was part of making that all happen and begin.
John Gray has made a lasting contribution to geriatric medicine. He's an example of someone whose legacy continues because he trained a lot of us, but he inspired us too. He's provided us with our ethic, our touchstone. We can think, is this what Dr. Gray would have done? If it was what Dr. Gray would have done, fair enough. We can go ahead and do that in complete confidence.
As a recipient of healthcare, which I obviously am at this point, it's so essential, I feel, for the elderly not only to have confidence that their doctor is competent, but that he is sensitive to them as a human being.